You did the same, yes? Said Jofi. Yes, I did the same. I didn't have a ship to carry me. I came by sea skipper. Candy smiled at the memory. It seemed so long ago. But my, you got here quicker than we expected, said Mespa. A lot quicker. Well, sisters, said Diamanda, unbraiding her hair as she spoke, it seems we will have to be very careful about laying our plans in future. A new and highly unpredictable element has entered our sphere, and she changes everything. It will be impossible to guess the future with any of the old confidence. She looked back at Candy. All we know is that we've got our hands full. What's changed? Said Candy. Please explain. There's so much I want to know. I feel as though I belong here for some reason, that this is really my home. The three women didn't make any attempt to dissuade her of this. Apparently they believe I belong here too, Candy thought. The realization made her eyes sting with happy tears. The women's smiles and silence were confirming something she hadn't dared to believe until now. She had a reason to be here. Even if nobody yet knew what it was, she still belonged. If I really do have some purpose here, Candy said, I mean, if I'm more than just some dumb sightseer, then can you help me understand what that purpose is? We'd be happy to, said Jofi. But I'm not sure we understand ourselves, Mespa went on. The starlight in her eyes trembled. The woman wasn't afraid, Candy thought, but filled with a curious excitement. Something's going to happen to me, isn't it? Candy said. My dear, something already has, Diamanda replied. You're not the same girl who threw herself into the Isabella, are you? Candy took a moment to think about this, but no more than a moment. No, I'm not. Then she said, I'm somebody else. I just don't know who that somebody else is yet. Well, that's what journeys are for, Diamanda Merkett said. Remember, I made the same trip myself, looking for something I didn't have. And trust me, Candy, wherever you think you're going, the real destination is right here. She tapped her chest directly above her heart. Will I ever go back to the hereafter? Candy said. The three women exchanged anxious looks. What's wrong? Said Candy, reading the discomfort in their eyes. Do you know something about this? We've had glimpses, Diamanda said. Only glimpses. There isn't much to tell, Jofi said. But the news is bad, Candy said. Not for you, Mespa said. Then who for? Jofi and Mespa both looked at Diamanda as though seeking some guidance from their elder. I'm not going to start making prophecies on the basis of glimpses, Diamanda said. But you should know, my dear, that from now on there is jeopardy at every step, for you, for those who travel with you, and even for the places you choose to go. You may bring down cities before you have solved all the mysteries that lie ahead of you. That sure sounds like a prophecy to me, said Mespa. Well, what do you suggest we tell her? The old lady said, a little irritated. We could begin with the stories we've been hearing about Finnegan. Who's Finnegan? Candy said, thinking halfway through the question that perhaps somebody on this journey had already told her because the name rang a bell. Or did she maybe know a Finnegan in Chicken Town? Oh, you'll like Finnegan, Diamanda said with a teasing little smile. That she will, said Mespa. Then there's the Requiacs, said Jofi, moving on before Candy had time to ask about Finnegan. Who are the Requiacs? Candy asked, determined to get an answer this time. There was silence for a moment. Candy looked from face to face. Please, she said, I need some help here. Mespa began. The Requiacs are the worst of the worst, she said. They're the enemies of love, Diamanda went on. The enemies of life, wicked beyond words. And where are they? Right now, said Jofi, they're deep in the Isabella, and let's hope they stay there. Doubtful, Diamanda went on. We hear all manner of rumors about the Requiacs being on the move, and there are those who say that when they surface it will be the end of the world as we know it. You're scaring me, Candy said. I forbid you to be scared, Diamanda replied gently. She was never scared, so you shouldn't be. She, said Candy. What do you mean, she? Curiously enough, all three women opened their mouths to reply to this, but before any of them could answer, there came the sound of a series of doors closing, maybe 10 in all, the smallest of which sounded like the noise of a doll's house door, the largest, a solid oak door, slamming somewhere nearby. "He's coming!" cried Jofi. "We've got to be off, Candy," Diamanda said. "Abraham Hollow, the keeper of the 25th hour, doesn't approve of anybody from the outside world being brought into the time out of time. If he knew you were here, he'd have the Fugit brothers tear you from limb to limb." "Nice," said Candy. "What do I do with all the questions I've still got?" "Keep them for another time," said Jofi. "But I have so many," Candy said. The women were clearly preparing to make a hasty exit, gathering up their robes, glancing around nervously as they did so. Obviously, they did not want to encounter this Abraham Hollow. "We'll find one another again," Diamanda said. "Don't you worry about that. There is so much to tell on both sides. Thank you for the news about Henry, by the way. You've shamed me into an apology." "But he's dead," Candy said. "A matter of little consequence here," said Diamanda. "Why?" "Because this is the 25th hour. Everything is here. Everything is now, even yesterday." "I don't—" "Will you hurry up, Diamanda Merkit?" said Mespa, catching hold of the old woman's hand. "I hear old Abraham coming." "Yes, yes," said Diamanda. "I'm coming. I just wanted her to understand." "We don't have time," said Mespa. "No time," said Jofi, laughing. "That's the one thing we surely have in abundance. Time and more time and time again." "Don't get clever," Mespa snapped. "I don't want Abraham finding us. Any of us. Now, come on!" She was pulling on Diamanda's arm now. "I'm sorry," the old lady said to Candy. "There's so much more I wanted to show you here, and we won't get another chance to sneak you in, I'm afraid. Even this little peep took a lot of maneuvering." "Will you stop gabbing?" Mespa said. "Yes, yes, coming." The light that had first revealed the women was brightening all around them. In a few seconds they would be gone. But before the sisters were eroded by the brightness, Diamanda reached out and touched Candy's arm. "I envy you," she said. "You do? The journey ahead of you. It's going to be quite something. The things that are out there waiting to be discovered." She smiled and shook her head. "You cannot imagine," she said. "Truly, you cannot imagine." Then her fingers drew back from Candy's arm, and the three women vanished into the flux of light. As they disappeared, Candy caught a glimpse of the door slammer, Abraham Hollow, the keeper of the time out of time. He was no more than 10 yards away, standing on the threshold of a door that he had just closed, and staring down at something at his feet. He was dressed in voluminous scarlet robes, and his thin face was possessed of that smoothness and translucence that sometimes comes with extreme old age. He wore tiny round black-lensed spectacles which concealed his eyes, and had a matted mop of white hair on his head. "There you are, Tattle," he said, addressing a large piebald aberration rat which had appeared from between his feet. With great effort, Hollow bent down and offered the sleeve of his robe to the rat. The animal instantly scampered up the sleeve and ran along Hollow's stooped shoulder to his ear as though whispering into it. Indeed, perhaps the rat was doing just that, because the old man then muttered to himself, "An interloper, eh? I should maybe summon the brothers." He opened the door behind him and called back through it, "Tempus? Julius?" Time to go, Candy thought, before I'm caught trespassing. But in which direction should she run? There was darkness everywhere except for the light on the threshold where Abraham Hollow and his telltale rat stood. She decided the best thing to do was simply turn her back on the old man and run in the opposite direction. She did exactly that, racing off into the darkness and silently cursing the three sisters for heading off without taking her with them. "There," said Abraham Hollow. "I hear our trespassers' feet. Over there!" Candy glanced back over her shoulder. The door at which Hollow and Tattle stood had been flung wide, as had the door behind it, and the door behind that door, and through them came the Fugit brothers. Candy had been warned, of course, about the dangers of the 25th. She'd been told how all the people who'd ventured here over the years had either disappeared or been driven mad. One glimpse of the Fugit brothers, and she understood why. They had the faces of clowns, white skin, gaping mouths, and pop eyes, but that was the least of it. What was truly distressing was the fact that their features, their eyes, their mouths, their noses, their ears, and even the 3 little tufts of red hair they sported, were moving around their faces like the hands of crazy clocks. Despite the fact that their mouths were on the move, they still spoke. "I see her, Brother Julius," said one of the brothers.
"Me too, Brother Tempest, me too."
"I say we tear out her heart, Brother Julius." "I say we make her crazy first, Brother Tempest." So that was the way of it, Candy thought. One vote for lunacy, one vote for murder. Either way, if these two caught her, she would never live to learn from what she'd seen in the time out of time. She didn't wait to hear any more of their chatter. She fled into the darkness which enveloped her completely. She could see no sign of a way out in any direction, no door, no window, not so much as a sliver of light from the outside world. There was nothing to be lost from yelling for help, she thought. After all, these clock-faced clowns knew where she was. So she called to Malingo in the vain hope that he would hear her. "Malingo! I'm over here!" Wherever here was. "Please, if you can hear me, yell back." She got an answer, but it wasn't the one she wanted. It was an echo of what she'd just yelled, but the walls it had bounced off of had rearranged the words and made nonsense of them. "You can, if me, yell back here, here. I'm over, Malingo." Even the echoes had their own tricks in this place. As the words died away, she heard 2 soft voices horribly close. "I believe we should take her, Brother Julius." "I believe we should, Brother Tempest. I believe we should." They sounded as though they were 2 or 3 yards away. She didn't wait for them to get any nearer. She headed off into the darkness again, not caring where she went, just determined not to allow the Fugit brothers to catch up with her. She couldn't run forever, she knew. It was only a matter of time before the clowns on her heels caught up with her. And then what? Well, they'd already laid out their options. Even if she escaped their clutches, the echoes and the memory of her pursuers' circling faces would take their toll. Whatever wonders she had witnessed here would be erased by insanity. No, she couldn't let that happen. She ran on blindly, determined she was not going to be numbered among those who'd escaped the 25th, too crazy to tell their tale. Chapter 32. Monsoon. The exhausted survivors of the sinking Belbello spent their first day on the island of the Nonce at the beach where they'd been washed ashore. Every time the tide came in, it would bring more pieces of the wreckage up onto the sand, splintered timbers and rope, mostly. They didn't expect to have to build fires on the island. It was warm at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. What need would they have of fire? So the timber was of very little use. But every now and again a box of supplies was washed up, including a box of emergency rations. Unfortunately, there was no medication for Mischief and his brothers, who were still in very poor condition. Though their wounds had stopped bleeding, there was no sign of consciousness returning. All Geneva, Tom, the captain, and Tria could do was to work together to build a small shelter out of branches and leaves and lay the brothers in it, away from the heat of the mid-afternoon sun. Luckily, both Tom and the captain still had their copies of Klepp's almanac, and each had a different edition, so they were able to consult the pamphlet on a wide variety of matters. "It isn't always reliable information," Geneva cautioned them, as Tom proposed to make a stew of berries he'd found when he'd ventured a little deeper into the island. "We could very well poison ourselves." "I doubt there'd be a recipe in the almanac which produced poisonous food," Tom said. "So you say," Geneva said, plainly unconvinced. "But if we all get sick—" While they'd been arguing about this, Tria had been picking up the berries one by one and sniffing them. A few, particularly the smaller greenish berries, she tossed away. The rest she left in the bag in which Tom had collected them and declared with her usual strange confidence, "These are all right." The stew was duly cooked, and it proved to be delicious. "We still could have got sick from the green ones," Geneva reminded Tom and the captain, "if Tria hadn't stopped us from eating them." "Oh, for goodness sake, Geneva," McBean said. "Let it go. We've got more important things to worry about without arguing over stew." "Such as?" "Such as him." McBean glanced in the direction of mischief. "I mean them," he said, correcting himself. "I'm afraid they're slipping away from us." "I don't know where we go for help," said Tom. "According to the almanac, there aren't any towns on the island, so if there are any doctors around, they're living in the wild. There are a lot of churches, but Klepp describes most of them as abandoned." "There's the Palace of Bowers," Geneva said. "Perhaps there's still some people there." "How far is the palace from here?" Captain McBean asked Tom. "See for yourself," Tom said, proffering his edition of Klepp's almanac so that all of them could see it. He pointed to a bay on the north-northwesterly side of the island. "I believe we're here," he said, "and the palace is way over here. It's probably 2 days' walk, maybe more if the landscape between here and there is hilly." "Which it is," said Geneva. "The whole island is hilly, but we can still carry mischief between us." "Is moving them a wise idea?" McBean asked. "I don't know," Geneva replied, shaking her head. "I'm no doctor." "That's the problem. None of us are," said Tom. "If I had to guess, I'd say moving them would be fatal, but maybe waiting here is an even worse idea." At that moment, everybody stopped staring at the map and looked up. The wind had suddenly risen, making the great blossom-filled banks of foliage in whose shadows they sat churn and sigh, and carried on that wind there came the sound of hundreds of voices all singing a wordless song. "We're not alone," said the captain. The music was both majestic and serene. "Snakes," said Tria. "Snakes?" said the captain. "She's right," Tom told him. "There's a red and yellow serpent on the island called the Vigil Snake. They sing. It says so in the almanac." "I don't remember snakes on this island," Geneva said. "Yes, you do," said Tom. "They were requested by the princess for the wedding." "Exactly. Finnegan had them brought over from Scoriae, which is their natural habitat. Apparently they liked it here. Klepp said they all escaped in the confusion after all that happened at the wedding, and they have no natural enemies here on the Nonce, so they bred and bred. Now they're everywhere." "Are they poisonous?" Tria asked. It was perhaps the first time that any of them had heard her voice any fear about the natural world. "No," said Tom. "Very mild-mannered, as I remember, and very musical." "Amazing," said the captain. "What are they singing? Is it just nonsense?" "No," said Tom. He read from the almanac. "The song that the Vigil Snake sings is in fact one immensely long word, the longest in the ancient language of the species. It is so long that an individual can sing it for a lifetime and never come to the end of it." "That sounds like a Kleppism to me," Geneva said. "How would they ever learn it?" "Good question," said Tom. "Maybe they're born with it, like a migration instinct?" "Born with a song?" said Geneva. Tom smiled. "Yes, don't you like that idea?" "Liking it and having it be true aren't the same thing, Tom." "Huh. Sometimes you need to let things strike your heart and not your head, Geneva." "And what's that supposed to mean?" snapped Geneva. "Never mind." "No, tell me, Tom," she said, bristling. "Don't make sly remarks, and then—" "It wasn't sly." "Well, how else would you—" "I resent being called—" "And I resent—" "Stop it," said Tria, "both of you." The girl had sudden tears in her eyes. "Look at them." While the argument between Tom and Geneva had been mounting, Mischief and his brothers had started to breathe in a most terrible fashion, a rattle in their collective throats that did not bode well. "Oh, Lord!" Tom threw aside the almanac and went over to the little bed of leaves and blossoms where they'd laid the brothers. "This doesn't sound good at all." He went down on his knees beside Mischief and laid a hand on his brow. Mischief's eyes were rolling back and forth wildly behind his lids, and his breathing was getting quicker and shallower with every passing moment. At the same time, as though there was some strange synchronicity in the air, the argument, the singing, the wind, and now Mischief's anguish all happening within seconds of one another, the captain looked skyward and announced, "I think we should get our stuff under cover." He didn't need to explain why. A vast thunderhead moved over the sun as he spoke, and the wind in the trees grew suddenly stronger, stripping some of the more fragile blooms of their petals. There was a sudden burst of activity as everyone did as the captain had suggested, but fast though they weren't fast enough to move everything before the rain began. There were a few scattered drops, and then, in a matter of seconds, the drops became a torrential downpour, the rain coming down with such vehemence they had to shout to make themselves heard. "You and me, Tom!" the captain yelled. "We'll take Mischief together." "Where are we going?" Tom hollered. "Up there," McBean said, pointing up a small slope between the trees. The rainfall was so powerful that rivulets of sandy brown water, carrying a freight of dead leaves, twigs, blossoms, and the occasional dead rodent, were running down the slope. The area around Mischief's makeshift bed was already an inch deep in water. There was a flash of lightning now, followed by a roll of thunder. The rain came on with fresh attack, as though it wanted to wash the world away. "Let me carry him," Tom said, having to yell until his throat was a roar over the noise of cracking boughs and rolling thunder. The captain didn't have an opportunity for argument. Tom simply picked up Mischief in his arms and, putting his head down so as not to be blinded by the rain, proceeded to climb to higher ground. The others followed, all carrying what they could rescue from their little encampment. And still the rain came on, with mounting power, until the world was reduced to a deafening gray-green blur. Step by step, Tom climbed the slope until he was 2/3 of the way to the top. Then, out of nowhere, a large log came down the slope, carried by the force of the flood. Tom tried to move aside to avoid being struck, but the weight of the brothers slowed him. The log caught him a heavy blow, knocking his legs out from under him. Down he went, and Mischief slipped from his arms. They were both carried back down the slope, knocking everybody else over as they descended. When they reached the bottom, it was like being thrown into the midst of a fast-flowing river. Geneva caught hold of Tria to stop the child from being swept away down the beach and out into the sea. McBean, in turn, caught hold of Geneva with his right hand and grabbed a tree with his left, holding on for dear life until the monsoon had exhausted itself. And still it mounted, beating down on their heads. It was as if the skies had opened and unleashed 100 years of rain. And then, just as abruptly as it had begun, it all ceased. It was as though a faucet had been turned off. The sun broke through the exhausted clouds, and it illuminated a battered world. Every single blossom had been stripped of its petals by the force of the rain. The smaller leaves had been pulled off the twigs, the larger ones shredded. Bushes had been uprooted and carried down onto the beach and into the surf, which was no longer white, but tinted reddish-brown by the mud that had been washed into it. Weary from the relentless assault of the rain, McBean, Geneva, Tria, and Tom stood ankle-deep in mud and debris. Unable to speak, they stared up at the sky, watching the patches of blue grow between the thinning clouds. As the warmth of the sun pierced the bruised canopy and touched the greenery around the survivors, they were all witness to a phenomenon that Klepp had failed to mention in his almanac. Apparently he had never been on the Nance when a rainstorm had been unleashed, because if he had, the ensuing miracle would surely have been reported in his almanac's pages. Everywhere around them, the wounded plant life was beginning to grow again. Roots, many of which had been exposed by the force of the water, stretched down like gnarled fingers into the muddied ground. From broken twigs and cracked boughs, new growth sprang up, healthy and green, buds fattening and bursting in front of their astonished eyes. Vines curled and climbed from the remains of their rain-beaten elders like eager green children, while ferns sprang up, uncoiling their tender shoots at such speed they were grazing the lower boughs of the trees in seconds. "Oh, my," Tom said. "Have you ever seen anything like this before?" Geneva asked the captain. He slowly shook his head. "Never," he said. This spectacle of growth would have been extraordinary enough in itself, but there was more. The monsoon had awoken dormant elements in the greenery, parts of its blossoming anatomy that didn't entirely resemble plants. Wasn't that an eye surreptitiously opening in the head of a flower? And something uncannily like a mouth gaping in the moisture-fattened bulbs of a plant that sat half in the earth and half out, like a bright green onion? On all sides there were signs of this uncanny life. Cracklings and mutterings and stretching and, yes, even something like laughter, as though the plants were hugely amused by the sight of their own protean lives. It was Tria who first said, "Where's Mischief?" Everybody looked around. The John brothers were not to be seen. The captain sent everyone in different directions, telling them to look quickly, as this was a matter of life and death. "If they're lying face down in water, they could be drowning right now." His words gave urgency to everybody's search. There were large, shallow pools of muddy rainwater at the bottom of the slope. They went through them from end to end on their hands and knees, desperately hoping to find Mischief before too much time passed. Meanwhile, the greenery continued to become more active and more fruitful around them, the buds bursting like popcorn, releasing the sweet fragrance of new flowers. Some of the plants were so eager to be fruitful that they were already releasing clouds of pollen that filled the air like soft, golden smoke. The survivors, of course, noticed none of this. They were concerned about Mischief. Nothing was said, but everyone was beginning to fear the worst. Perhaps the force of the water had carried him down the slope of the beach and out to sea. If not, where was he? It was Tria, the ever-observant Tria, who pointed out what had happened to the rest of their belongings. The things that they'd attempted to save from the monsoon and had successfully carried back up the slope only to lose them again when they'd tumbled back down were all in one spot. They had been gathered together, it seemed, by the large serpentine tendrils of an enormous plant that sat in regal solitude at the bottom of the incline. They went to examine it. The plant was continuing to grow and thrive, its huge seed pods shiny green with health. They creaked as they grew and gave off the pungent smell of all green-growing things. The plant was like a little grove unto itself, its outer layer a knotted thicket of freshly sprung and interwoven flora. It was here that articles from their encampment had been brought by the water. Now they were part of the elaborate network of tendrils, as though some ambitious intelligence in the plant was attempting to turn them into bizarre blossoms. Beyond the thicket, at the heart of this miniature forest, the foliage grew considerably denser. So dense, in fact, that it almost hid from sight an enormous seed pod dripping with the juices of its recent creation. "Will you take a look at that?" said Tom, parting the veil of tendrils. "There," Tria said. "He's in there." "Mischief?" Geneva asked her. Tria nodded. The other three exchanged confounded looks. "Here, Captain," Tom said. "Lend me a hand, will you?" They began to pull at the outer layer of the thicket, and the tendrils uncoiled and wrapped around their hands and arms, around their legs, too. They were too thin, perhaps too playful, to do any real harm, but they still slowed the men's advance. "I wish I had a knife," the captain said. "Oh, let me at it," said Geneva. "You two will be fighting that stuff all day." She stepped between them and started to pull at the tangled mass. Now all three of them were in the midst of the green coils, and pieces of flora were flying in all directions. But Geneva was a better tactician than the other two. She ducked down under the great mass of thicket, and then, once she was on the other side, pushed it out like two enormous doors, which Tom and the captain grabbed hold of, creating a passageway into the heart of the grove. They were all breathless now, fragments of the leaves stuck to the sweat on their faces and caught on their eyelashes and in their hair. They stood aside as Tria entered through the opening they'd made and approached the pod that all this foliage had been protecting. "Be careful," Tom said to her. He'd no sooner spoken than the pod, which was hanging from a great looping network of vines, began to move. Small tremors ran through it as though something inside was having a little fit. Its seams began to split with a sound of tearing canvas, spitting gobs of sweet juice as it did so. Tria turned and looked at the adults. "See?" she said, an expression of delight on her face, a rare sight indeed. The top of the pod now flew open like the lid of a casket, and there, lying in a mess of mud and water, but cushioned by the leaves and the coiled tendrils that lined the pod, was John Mischief and his brothers. Their eyes were still closed, but something, perhaps the light suddenly falling on their upturned faces when the lid rose, now stirred them. John Moot was the first to open his eyes. He blinked hard. Then he frowned and let out a little laugh. "What happened?" he said. "You're awake," said Tom. John Drowse piped up next. "So am I." It was like watching the stars come out at night as now, one by one, the John brothers opened their eyes and the light of full consciousness returned into their puzzled faces. Mischief himself, however, remained comatose, even though in a short time every other one of his brothers was awake. "We should lift you out of here," Tom said to them, "before the greenery thinks about swallowing you up again." "Don't bother," said Serpent. "We'll wake him, and then he can climb out himself." "You might have difficulty," said Geneva, peering closely at Mischief. "He's showing no sign of stirring." "Don't worry," said John Sallow. "We do it all the time when he's dozing," John Slop said. Then, looking at his brothers, "Is everybody ready?" There were murmurs of affirmation from both antlers. John Serpent took the countdown. 3, 2, 1. And as a single voice, the Johns all yelled, "Mischief!" At first there was no response, absolutely none. They held their breath, Philip, Sallow, Moot, Drowse, Pluckett, Serpent, and Slop included. Then there was the tiniest of twitches in Mischief's left eyelid, and a moment later his eye opened. His right eye followed a heartbeat later. "What am I doing lying in this plant?" was the first thing he said, and rolled out of it onto the rain-sodden, root-covered ground. He winced as he fell. "Damn fool, Mischief," John Serpent said. "Will you be more careful? This body of ours is wounded, remember?" "The dragon," John Mischief said. "You remember?" said Geneva. Mischief nodded. "Well, that's good." "Of course we remember," John Serpent said. "A thing like that you don't forget." "I just don't know how I got from there to here," Mischief said. "Well, that's for us to tell and you to listen," Geneva replied with a smile. "Give me a hand up, somebody," Mischief said, offering his arm to Tom. "I've got you," Tom said, hauling the brothers to their feet. The greenery was still burgeoning on every side, so they all stumbled out of the grove together, picking pieces of tendril and shredded leaf out of their hair and from inside their clothes. The sun was bright and warm. There wasn't a cloud in the sky. Even the deepest of the puddles was rapidly soaking into the ground. "Welcome to the nonce," said Tom to the Johns. "You were as close to death as anyone could get and still come back." "We're not going anywhere," John Mischief said, carefully stretching in the warmth. "We've got a lot of adventuring to do, dragons to fight, Finnegan to find." "What is that music?" John Sallow said. "It's the snakes of the nonce singing," Tom replied. A broad grin spread over John Mischief's face. "See?" he said, making a tiny shake of his head. "That's another thing we've got to do. We've got to listen to the snakes sing." Chapter 33. All Things in Time. Candy ran and kept running without daring to look back over her shoulder at the Fugit brothers. She didn't need to. They kept up an almost ceaseless exchange as they came after her.
She doesn't know where she's going, Brother Tempest.
"Nor she does, Brother Julius, nor she does."
She could trip at any moment, Brother Tempest.
"Flat on her face, Brother Julius, flat on her face." They were like a couple of bad comedians, all talk and no punchline. In fact, their chatter was so irritating she was half tempted to turn around and tell them to shut up. But then she thought of their vile, unfixed features circling and circling, and her appetite for confrontation faded. Better to just run. There had to be some way out of here. After all, she'd got in, hadn't she? But no matter which way she looked, there was no sign of an exit, just the same featureless darkness in all directions. And she was getting tired. Her chest was tight and her throat was raw. Sooner or later, she knew she was going to stumble. When she did, her talkative pursuers would be on her in a heartbeat.
"She's slowing down, Brother Julius."
"That I see, Brother Tempest, that I see." Just to prove the pair wrong, Candy put on an extra spurt of energy. As she did so, she remembered the chaotic moments that had preceded her entrance into this dark place, how the glyph had turned over, flinging her out. "Ah," she thought, "maybe that's the answer to my problem." Here she was looking for a door, assuming there was no way out except through a door. But she hadn't come in that way, had she? Maybe her best escape route was to throw herself into the darkness and trust to fate. She glanced over her shoulder. The brothers were no more than a few strides behind her. If she was going to try and escape them, it was now or never. She counted to 3. 1.
What did she say, Brother Julius?
2.
I didn't catch it, Brother Tempest.
3. And with that she pitched herself forward, almost as though she were diving into a pool of water. It worked. The moment her body was free of the ground, the darkness around her seemed to convulse. She was instantly released from its grip, and she felt herself tumbling over and over. A moment later, there was light, and she fell heavily among the rocks on the shore of the 25th. She landed so hard that her breath was knocked from her. For a few moments she lay there gasping and bruised, listening to the sound of the waves and the din of the seabirds squabbling over some piece of fish that had been washed up. Then, from nearby, there came a reassuring voice. "Lady?" Seconds later, Malingo's face came into view, upside down. "You're here! You're alive!" Candy was still in a mild state of shock. She opened her mouth to answer Malingo, but at first all that would come out was a trail of disconnected words. "Running, clocks, faces, Tempest Fugit, and Julius, horrible, too horrible." "Oh, my poor lady," Malingo said. "Did they make you crazy in there?" "I'm not crazy," Candy said, pushing herself up into a sitting position. She took a deep breath and tried to construct a more coherent sentence. "I've got a few bruises," she said, "but I'm sane. I swear I am, and I'm alive." "Alive you are," Malingo said with a bright smile. Candy laughed. She'd done it. She'd actually escaped the 25th hour. She got to her feet and embraced Malingo. "The things I've seen. she said to him. "You wouldn't believe some of the things—"
"Such as?"
said Malingo, eyes gleaming with curiosity. Candy opened her mouth, intending to describe her adventures inside the 25th, but then she decided against it. "You know what?" she said. "Perhaps it's best not to do it here." She stared at the wall of roiling mist that separated the beach from the secret world on the other side. Anybody could be on the other side, she reasoned, listening, or worse, ready to pounce and drag her back in. "We should get out of here first," she said to Malingo, "before the Fugit brothers catch up with us." "Who are the Fugit brothers?" Malingo said. Before she could offer a reply, Candy caught sight, from the corner of her eye, of something emerging from a crack between the stones. She looked around and focused on it. The thing moved sideways, like a crab, but it was no animal. It was a mouth. A mouth with legs. "Oh, no," she said softly. "What's wrong?" said Malingo. "Where's the glyph?" Candy said. "The glyph?" "Yes, the glyph," Candy said, as an eye with legs appeared from under the rocks and blinked up at her. This time Malingo followed her gaze. "What are they?" "They belong to the Fugit brothers," Candy said, catching hold of Malingo's arm and pulling him away from the spot. If a mouth and eye were here, could the brothers that owned them be far behind? "They live in the 25th, Candy said hurriedly, "and if they get hold of us—" She didn't have a chance to finish. The rocks nearby had started to shake, their motion gentle at first, but quickly becoming stronger. It wasn't hard to guess what was going on. Tempest and Julius had somehow burrowed out under the stones, and they were planning a surprise attack from below. They would have succeeded in their surprise, too, if their wandering features hadn't given their sneaky game away. "We have to get out of here," Candy said. Malingo was still staring at the stones, which were rattling together. "Where's the glyph, Malingo?" "That's an eye on legs." "Yes, I know. Malingo, where's the glyph?" He pointed back down the beach without looking at where he was pointing. She followed his finger, and, yes, there was the craft lying on the stones. It was overturned, but at least it looked to be intact. The impact of striking the wall of the 25th hadn't smashed it to smithereens. "Come on," she said to Malingo, pulling on his arm again. He didn't move, however. The strange life forms on the stones had him entranced. "We can't wait around here," Candy said, "or we're dead." The rocks were being rolled aside now, the smaller ones thrown into the air as the Fugit brothers prepared to make their entrance. "I never saw anything like that before," Malingo said, his voice filled with fascination. "Can we please go?" Before they could take a step, however, a dark voice rose from the crevices between the rocks. "You won't escape us, Candy Quackenbush," said one of the brothers. "Nor will your flap-eared friend," said his sibling. The sound of the Fugits' voices punctured Malingo's curiosity. Now it was he who backed away from the spot where the rocks were shaking. "You're right," he said to Candy. "We should go." Finally. There was no more hesitation. The two of them raced together over the slimy stones toward the beached glyph. "Let's hope it still works," Candy said to Malingo as they ran. "What do we do if it doesn't?" "I don't know," Candy said grimly. "We'll worry about that if it happens." They had reached the vehicle now, and they instantly got to work pushing it back into an upright position. Something rattled as the glyph rocked back into place, which didn't sound particularly optimistic. "Get in," Candy said. As Malingo slipped into his seat, Candy dared a momentary glance along the beach. One of the brothers, Candy didn't know whether it was Julius or Tempest, had now dug himself clear of the stones, but there was no sign of the other. Still, she thought, one of them could do plenty of damage. He started to stride along the beach toward Candy and Malingo, pointing toward them as he did so. "You will not leave this island!" he yelled as he approached. "Do you hear me? You will not leave!" Even as he spoke, he proceeded to pick up his speed, his stride quickly breaking into a run. Now it was Malingo who was urging Candy to get into the glyph. "Hurry," he said. Candy put one foot into the glyph. As she lifted her other leg, an arm was thrust up out of the stones beside the glyph and seized hold of her calf. She let out a yelp of shock. The stones rolled away as the second Fugit brother pushed himself out of the ground, using Candy to haul himself up.
"Hold her, Brother Julius!"
Tempest yelled as he came racing down the beach. "Help me!" Candy yelled to Malingo. She reached down and tried to unknot Julius's fingers, but his grip was cold and strong. Malingo put both his arms around Candy and pulled hard on her. Desperation gave him strength. Candy's clothes tore, and Fugit's grasping hands were left holding 2 pieces of shredded fabric. Freed of the monster's grip, Candy looked straight down into Julius's face. His crawling features had assembled now. His eyes were wide and hungry. His mouth wore the contented smile of a hunter who believed he had his prey trapped. "You're not going anywhere," he said, and reached up to catch hold of Candy again. Without hesitation, she put her foot down on the middle of Julius's face, putting all her weight behind it. The creature let out a cry of rage and frustration and slipped back down into the darkness. Tempest, meanwhile, was no more than 20 strides away, racing over the stones.
"Halt!" he yelled. "Both of you, halt!"
Candy ignored him. She climbed back into the glyph, her thoughts entirely focused on the next challenge, getting the craft into the air. "What are the words?" she said to Malingo. "Neo-Kethica." "Of course, that's it." Candy took a deep breath and closed her eyes, picturing the glyph rising into the air. Then she spoke the words, "Neo-Kethica." The response from the glyph was instantaneous. The vehicle's engine made a strangled choking sound, and for a moment it seemed the craft was going to ascend. It rocked and shuddered, but unfortunately there was no upward movement. Candy looked up. Tempest was getting closer by the moment. "Neo-Kethica," she said again. "Come on, glyph, Neo-Kethica." There was more noise from the craft's engine, but it wasn't promising. "It's a lost cause," Malingo said, his eyes on the approaching Fugit brother. "We should get away." Before he could finish, Julius Fugit made another lunge from the hole beside the glyph. He failed to catch hold of Candy, but his hands seized the craft. The vehicle started to tip over. Candy let out a yell as she slid from her seat toward Julius's grinning face. Malingo caught hold of her arm and pulled her back, scrambling to get them both out of the craft. As he did so, Candy tried one last cry of "Neo-Kethica!" in hope of awakening the glyph's engine. But it didn't work. "Come on!" Malingo yelled, hauling her over the side of the toppling machine. He was just in time. As Candy stumbled backward into Malingo's arms, the glyph fell over, trapping Julius Fugit beneath its weight.
"Help me, brother!"
Julius yelled. Tempest was 2 or 3 strides away.
"I'm coming for you, brother!"
he yelled, and threw himself on the craft, tearing at its decaying structure to reach his sibling.
"Don't make me wait, Brother Tempest!"
"I'm doing the best I can." "I'm sure you are, brother, I'm sure you are." "We're in trouble," Malingo murmured to Candy. He was right. It would take Tempest only a minute or 2 to free his brother, then the 2 of them would come in pursuit of their quarry with fresh zeal. And where were Candy and Malingo to go? The beach offered nothing by way of hiding places, and they couldn't outrun the Fugit brothers for very long. Candy shook her head in desperation. "It can't end this way," she said to herself. For all the grimness of their prospects, she couldn't believe it was all going to end here. After the journeys she'd taken and the visions she'd seen, she couldn't die on a deserted beach at the hands of a couple of crazy brothers. It wasn't right. She knew in her heart that she had more journeying to do, more visions to see. Wasn't that why the 3 women had allowed her that glimpse into the mysteries of her life before she was even born? They were preparing her for something, telling her to be ready to solve some major secrets. The Fugit brothers weren't going to put a stop to all that. She wasn't going to let them. "It can't end here," she said aloud. "What can't?" Malingo replied. "Our lives. Us." Malingo looked startled by the fierceness in her voice and in her eyes. "I won't let it." She'd no sooner spoken than a breath of wind came from off the sea as though it were somehow answering her heartfelt plea. The gust cooled the sweat on Candy's face. Despite everything, she managed a smile. "We'd better start running," Malingo said. He pointed back toward the glyph. The Fugit brothers were now clear of the glyph's wreckage and were coming toward Candy and Malingo. Their features were on the move again, their grinning mouths racing around their faces like runners circling a track. "Our friends appear to have nowhere left to run, Brother Tempest." "So it would seem, Brother Julius, so it would seem." There was another gust of wind from the sea, and its coolness made Candy unglue her gaze from the approaching assassins and chance a look toward the water. The wind had thinned the colorless mist that hung over the waves, and through it came a patch of bright red. Red! "A boat!" Candy yelled. "What?" "Look, a boat!" The mist parted, and a simple little vessel with a single mast and much-mended sail came into view. It had neither captain nor passengers. "Ha!" said Malingo. "Will you look at that?" They raced down to the water and strode into the mild surf. The wind was coming in stronger and still stronger gusts. It filled the patchwork sail until the ropes creaked under the strain. "Get in," Candy said to Malingo. "Quickly, in!" "But the wind's just blowing the boat back to shore," Malingo said. "Back to them." The Fugit brothers had followed them down to the water's edge. They, too, had read the direction of the wind and had apparently decided they had no need to get their feet wet. All they had to do was wait. The boat would come to them. Candy glanced back at them as a large wave came in, wetting her all the way up to her neck. She let out a little yelp of shock, much to the amusement of the brothers. "Please," she said to Malingo, "just get in. Have a little faith." "In what?" "In me." Malingo stared at her for a moment, then shrugged and clambered in a rather ungainly fashion into the boat. Candy stole a moment to offer up a little prayer to the women of the Phantomaya. Surely it had been they who'd sent the boat. But what was the use of a boat without the right wind? "Help me," she murmured. And as she spoke, the sail of the boat snapped like a flag in the wind, and Candy looked up to see the women, all three of them, standing in the boat. It was a vision intended for her eyes only, it seemed. Neither the Fugit brothers nor Malingo responded to the sight. Malingo offered his hand to Candy. She caught hold of it, and he hauled her on board. She had no sooner set foot on the timbers of the little boat than Diamanda lifted her hands into the air. They were clenched tight, Candy saw, white-knuckled fists. "Travel safely," the old lady said. Candy nodded. "I will." "And don't breathe a word of any of this," said Jofi. "I won't." "What is this I will, I won't stuff?" Malingo said. "Are you talking to me?" Luckily, Candy didn't have any need to tell a lie, because at that instant Diamanda unclenched her fists. As she did so, the wind abruptly shifted, swinging around so fast that Candy could feel it move over her face, blowing against her left cheek one moment, and 2 seconds later blowing hard against her right. The boat shook from bow to stern, the ropes creaked, and the old patched sail filled with a fierce wind that now came from the landward side, a wind so strong that its gusts fattened the canvas to near bursting point. Candy looked back over her shoulder at the Fugit brothers, who were now wading into the frenzied surf in pursuit of the escapees. But the waves broke against them with no little force, slowing them down. Tempest lunged forward, attempting to catch hold of the boat before it was beyond his reach, but he was too late. The wind bore the little vessel away at such a speed he missed his grip and fell face down in the water. Candy smiled up at the women. They didn't linger more than another moment, just time enough to return Candy's smile. Then they were gone, their delicate forms blown away by the very wind Diamanda had summoned. "That was a close call," Malingo said. He was watching the diminishing figures of the Fugit brothers neck-high in the surf. They were hoping, presumably, that the wind would veer and carry their quarry back to them. But theirs was a lost cause. The gusts quickly drove the little vessel away from the island, and very soon the mist that always hung around the 25th hour covered the sight of the rocky shore. Exhausted but happy, Candy turned her back on the island and faced the open sea. There would come a time when she would think very closely about all that had happened to her in the labyrinths of the 25th hour, about what the women had said and shown her, the visions of tomorrow, the mysteries of yesterday. But she was too tired to think such weighty thoughts now. "Do you have any clue where we're heading?" she asked Malingo. "I just found this old copy of Klepp's almanac in the bottom of the boat," he said, proffering the sodden pamphlet for Candy to study if she wished. She shook her head. "I think there's a sea chart in here somewhere," Malingo went on. "The trouble is, half the pages have rotted together." He delicately worked to tease the pages apart, but it was a nearly impossible task. "I guess we're just going to have to trust to the Isabella," Candy said. "You make her sound like a friend of yours." Candy trailed her hand in the cold water and splashed some up onto her face. Her eyes were heavy with fatigue. "Why not?" she said. "Maybe she is a friend of mine." "Just as long as she treats us nicely," Malingo said. "No 20-foot waves." "We'll be fine," Candy replied. "She knows we've been through some hard times." "She does?" "Oh, sure. She'll carry us somewhere nice." Candy lay her head on her arm and let her hand trail in the water. "Like I said, have faith. She'll bring us where we need to go."
This ends Disc 9. Abarat, Disc 10.
Chapter 34. Different Destinies. Once before, at the beginning of her adventures in the Abarat, Candy had been told to entrust herself to the care of Mama Isabella. On that occasion, she'd needed some extra help to survive her journey. This time, however, safe aboard the nameless boat that had come to find her on the shore of the 25th, she let the sea carry her where it wished to, and all was well. There were some provisions on the boat, plain but nourishing, and while she and Malingo ate, the wind carried them away from the time out of time and off between the islands. As they traveled, having no idea of where the tide was taking them, nor any fear that it would do them any harm, there were people across the archipelago who would have significant parts to play in Candy's destination who were about their own business. At midnight, for instance, Christopher Carrion was wandering the mist-shrouded island of Gorgosium, plotting, endlessly plotting. He was like a ghost haunting his own house. People were afraid of encountering him because lately the nightmares that moved in the fluids were more active than ever, lending him an even more terrible appearance. Nor was there any way to predict where he might next appear. Sometimes he was seen in the gallows forest feeding scraps of rotted meat to the vultures that assembled in stinking flocks there. Sometimes he was seen down in the mines, sitting in one of the exhausted seams. Sometimes he was spotted in one of the smaller towers where Mater Motley's seamstresses worked on creating an army of stitchlings. Those who did have the bad luck to encounter him in one place or another were always closely interrogated by those who did not. Everybody wanted to know what the likely mood of their lord might be. Did he look angry, perhaps? Not really, came the reply. Did he look distracted, as though his thoughts were elsewhere? No, not distracted either. Finally, some brave soul asked the question that everybody wanted an answer to, but all were too afraid to voice. Did he look demented? Ah, now, came the reply. Yes, perhaps that was it. Perhaps he did act a little crazily. The way he talked to himself as he wandered among the gallows or sat in the tunnel speaking softly as though he imagined that he was talking to someone very dear to him. A friend, perhaps? Yes, that was it. He spoke as though he was sharing secrets with a friend, and sometimes as he talked, he would reach into the seething fluids that he breathed, and he would fish out a nightmare and proffer it as if to his invisible guest. The gift of a nightmare. Was all this evidence of insanity? In any man other than Christopher Carrion, the answer would surely have been yes. But Carrion was a law unto himself. Who could judge the depths of his thoughts or of his pain? He kept no counsels, partook of nobody's advice. If he was planning a war, then it was not with the assistance of his generals. If he was planning murder, then he didn't look to the advice of assassins. The only clue to the subject of his present meditations was a name he was several times heard to mutter, a name that did not yet mean anything much to those who heard it, but very soon would. The name he spoke was Candy. He said it to himself not once, but many times, as though repetition would somehow summon up the owner and bring her near to him. But she did not come. For all his power, Christopher Carrion was alone at midnight, having nothing for company but the vultures at his heels, and the nightmares at his lips, and the echoes of that name he spoke over and over again. Candy, Candy, Candy. His behavior did not go unnoticed or unreported. There were creatures in the shadows all around the island watching what Carrion did and bringing reports of it to the top of the 13th tower, where the Lord of Midnight's grandmother, Mater Motley, sat in her high-backed rocking chair sewing stitchlings. It was her perpetual labor. She never stopped. She didn't even sleep. She was too old to sleep, she'd once said. She had no dreams left to dream. So she sewed and rocked and listened to the stories of her grandson's lonely vigils. Sometimes, when the skins of the stitchlings had piled up around her, and she was filled with a strange dementia of her own, Mater Motley also talked to herself. Unlike her grandson, she didn't call out for company. She spoke in an ancient language known as High Aberatic, which was incomprehensible to all those who listened to the old woman. But the listeners didn't need to comprehend her words to understand what Mater Motley was debating with herself. One look at the army of stitchlings she was assembling provided the answer to that question. War was her subject. War was her obsession. She was sewing the skins of soldiers together and planning their deployment as she labored. Over the years, the old woman and her seamstresses had created tens of thousands of warriors. Most of them, having only mud for muscle, needed neither to eat nor breathe. She had them assembled in great labyrinths beneath the island, where they waited in the darkness for the call to arms. And while they waited in the bowels of Gorgosium, Mater Motley waited too. Waited, sewed, and chatted to herself in the language of the ancients about the great coming time when Christopher Carrion would declare war upon the Islands of Light, and her army, her vast, soulless army of mud and thread and patches, would march to war in the name of midnight. As for the architect of Comexo City, Rojo Pixler, he had labors and ambitions and meditations of his own. At the heart of his Silver City, hidden away from the busy citizens that filled the streets of that metropolis, there was a great circular corridor. 100 feet in height, it was lined from floor to ceiling, on both of its walls, with screens. This was the place to which Pixler's tens of thousands of spies, the voyeuristic children of Vorzangler's universal eye, sent their reports. It had become a place that Rojo Pixler frequented more and more often, circling the corridor for hours on end, inspecting the numberless screens. In truth, he was not really interested in the information that came from Tasmagor or Babylonium or the Yebidim Day. It was those reports that came up from the depths of the Isabella that had lately caught Pixler's attention. Hour upon hour, he would traverse the ring on his flying disc, his hands locked behind his back, his feet set wide apart, studying the screens for news from the deepest trenches of the Isabella. And why? because there was life down there. His fishy spies, wandering deeper than they usually went, had sighted vast claw marks on the walls of the crevices, indisputable evidence that there was some order of creature in the depths of the Isabella that demanded his study. When he had consulted the grimoires he'd had stolen, searching their heavy pages for some clue as to the nature of these beasts, he had found more than he expected. In the 7th volume of Limerick 6, he'd discovered an apocalyptic text that described all too well the occupants of the abysses of the Isabella. They were a race of creatures called the Requiacs, beasts of sublime wickedness that lived, according to Dado Limerick, in the profound entrails of the Mother Sea. They wouldn't always remain there, Limerick prophesied. There would come a time when these creatures would rise out of the depths. They have long hungered, Limerick wrote, for that time when darkness fell upon these many islands of ours, erasing the light of sun, moon, and stars. In that terrible midnight, when all light hath passed away, they will come like a great pestilence, and commit such crimes against life as will change the order of things forever. This I, Dado Limerick, tell to be a truthful prophecy, and count myself glad to my soul's core that I will not be upon the living stage to witness these sights, for it will be beyond the wits of men to endure. The great cities will go to dust, and the great men and women also, and all be carried away by the wind. Pixler took Limerick's words to heart, especially the part about the crumbling cities. To see Comexo City wiped away, erased as though it had never even existed, it was unthinkable. He had to be ready for this terrible midnight when the Requiacs rose into view. Plans had to be laid, defenses strengthened. If the Requiacs appeared, as Limerick predicted, he and his dream city would be ready to defy the prophecy and stand against the darkness. Meanwhile, the architect of Comexo City rode the ring around and around, studying the screens, watching for some sign of movement in the uncharted depths of Mama Isabella. It was snowing in Chickentown, or so it seemed. Candy stood in the backyard of 34 Followell Street while fat flecks of white swirled around her and carpeted the brown dirt and the gray grass. But there was something odd about this blizzard. For one thing, it seemed to be happening in the middle of a heat wave. Candy's hair was pasted to her forehead with sweat, and her t-shirt glued to her back. For another thing, the snow was spiraling down out of a perfectly blue sky. Strange, she thought. She reached up and caught hold of one of the snowflakes. It was soft against her palm. She opened her hand. The flake had a drop of blood on it. Suspicious now, she examined the snowflake more closely. Despite the warmth of her hand, the flake wasn't melting. Before she could examine it more closely, however, a gust of wind came along and carried it away, leaving a fine trail of scarlet across the middle of her palm. She reached out and snatched at another flake, then at another and another. They weren't snowflakes, she now realized. They were feathers. Chicken feathers. The air was filled with a blizzard of chicken feathers. She felt them brushing against her face, some of them leaving little trails of blood. Horrible. She tried to wipe them off with the heels of her hands, but the storm of feathers seemed to be getting worse. "Candy!" Her father had come out of the house. He had a beer bottle in his hand. "What are you doing standing out here?" he demanded. Candy thought for a moment, then shook her head. The truth was that she didn't know what she was doing out here. Had she come to look at the snow? If so, she didn't remember doing so. "Get back inside," her father said. His neck was flushed and his eyes were bloodshot. There was a mean expression in his stare that she knew to be careful of. He was close to losing his temper. "You heard me," he said.
Go back in the house!
Candy hesitated. She didn't want to contradict her father when he was drunk, but nor did she want to go inside. Not with him in his present mood. "I just want to take a little walk," she said softly.
What are you talking about? You're not taking no walk. Now get the hell inside.
He reached out and caught hold of her, gripping her neck close to her shoulder so tightly she let out a yell. As though in response to her cry, there was an eruption of din in the yard around her, the clucking of countless chickens. The birds were everywhere, filling the yard in all directions. She felt a kind of revulsion at the sight of so many chickens, so many beaks, so many bright little eyes, so many heads cocked so that they could look up at her. "How did they get here?" she said, gently reaching up to free herself from her father's grip.
They live here, he said.
"What?"
You heard me, her father said, shaking her. God, you are so stupid. I said they live here. Look!
Candy turned her sickened gaze toward the house. He was right. There were chickens on the roof, carpeting it like beady-eyed snow, chickens at the windows lining the sills, chickens squatting all over the kitchen. On the table, on the sink, she could see her mother standing in the middle of the kitchen with her head bowed, weeping. "This is crazy," Candy murmured.
What did you say?
Her father shook her again, harder this time. She pulled herself free of him, stumbling backward as she did so. Somehow she lost her balance and fell down on the hard dirt, the bitter stench of chicken excrement filling her nostrils. Her father started to laugh, a mean, joyless laugh. "Candy?" somebody said. She had covered her face with her hands to keep the chicken's claws from scratching her, so she didn't see who it was, but somebody was calling her. Somebody in the house, was it? She peered between her fingers. "Stupid girl," her father said, reaching down to catch hold of her again. As he did so, the voice came a second time. "Candy?" Whose voice was that? It obviously wasn't her father. She cautiously let her hands fall from her face and looked around. Was there somebody else in the vicinity? No, just her father, laughing, and her mother weeping in the kitchen, and the chickens, the endless, ridiculous chickens. None of this made any sense. It was like some horrible... Wait, she thought. Wait, this is a dream. As she formed this thought, the voice that had been calling to her called again. "Please, Candy," he said. "Open your eyes." That's all I have to do, she thought to herself. All I have to do is open my eyes. The idea was so simple it made her weep. She could feel the tears pressing between her locked lashes and running down her cheeks. "Open your eyes," she told herself. "You're a great disappointment to me," her dream father was saying to her. "Did you know that? I wanted a daughter who'd love me. Instead I get you. You don't love me, do you?" She didn't reply to this. "Answer me!" he yelled. She had no answer to give, or at least none that he wanted to hear, so she simply looked up at him and said, "Goodbye, Dad. I gotta go." "Go?" he replied. "Where the hell are you ever gonna go? You're going nowhere. Nowhere!" Candy smiled to herself, and smiling, she opened her eyes. She was back in the single-sailed boat that had carried them away from the shore of the 25th hour. It was rocking gently like a cradle. No wonder she'd been lulled to sleep. Malingo was kneeling beside her, his leathery hand laid lightly on her shoulder. "There you are," he said when her eyes focused on him. "For a minute I didn't know whether to wake you or not. Then I decided you weren't enjoying your dream very much." "I wasn't." She sat up, and the tears she'd shed in her sleep ran down her cheeks. She let them fall. They seemed to have washed her sight clean in a curious way. The world around her, the Sea of Isabella and the sky filled with light-shot clouds, even the round-bellied sail, looked more beautiful than she had words to describe. She heard what she thought was laughter from the side of the boat and looked over to see that a school of fish the size of small dolphins, only covered in scales that had a golden sheen to them, were swimming beside the vessel, taking turns to leap into the bow wave and feel its foam seethe over their backs. The noise they were making was like laughter. No, she thought, it wasn't like laughter. It was laughter, and it was a sound that went well with the whole bright world that she'd woken to. Sea, sky, and sail. There was laughter in all of it at that moment. She got to her feet, the wind at her back. Its insistence reminded her of being in the lighthouse, what seemed an age ago, feeling the light pressing against her back as it summoned the Sea of Isabella. "I'm here, aren't I?" she said to Malingo, holding on to the mast to steady herself. Malingo joined the laughter now. "Of course you're here," he said. "Where else would you be?" Candy shrugged. "Just somewhere I dreamed about." "Chicken Town?" "How did you guess?" "The tears." Candy wiped the last of the wetness from her cheeks with her free hand. "For a minute," she began. "You thought you were stuck back there." She nodded. "Then when I woke up, I wasn't sure for a moment which one was real." "I think they probably both are," Malingo said. "And maybe one day we'll catch the tide and go back there, you and me." "I can't imagine why we'd ever do that." "I can't either," Malingo said. "But you never know. There was a time, I dare say, when you couldn't have imagined being here." Candy nodded. "It's true," she said. Her eyes had gone again to the laughing fish. They seemed to be competing with one another to see which of them could leap the highest and so gain her attention. "Do you think maybe a part of me has always been here in the Abarat?" Candy asked Malingo. "Why do you say that?" "Well, it's that this place feels as though it's home, not that other place. This." She looked up. "This sky," then at the water. "This sea." Finally, she looked at her hand. "This skin." "It's the same skin here as it was there." "Is it?" she said. "It doesn't feel that way somehow." Malingo grinned. "What are you laughing at now?" "I'm just thinking what a strange one you are. My heroine." He kissed her on the cheek, still grinning. "Strangest girl I ever did meet." "And how many girls have you met?" Malingo took a moment or two to make his calculations. Then he said, "Well, just you, actually, if you don't count Mother." Now it was Candy who started to laugh, and the leaping fish joined in, jumping higher and higher in their delight. "Do you think they get the joke?" Malingo said. Candy looked skyward. "I think today the whole world gets the joke," she said. "Good answer," Malingo replied. "Look at that," Candy said, pointing up into the heavens. "We must be moving toward a night hour. I see stars." The wind had carried all the clouds off toward the southwest. The sky was now a pristine blue, darkening to purple overhead. "Beautiful," she said. Staring up at the pinpricks of starlight, Candy remembered how she had first noticed that the constellations were different here from the way they were in the world she had come from. Different stars, different destinies. "Is there such a thing as aberration astrology?" she said to Malingo. "Of course. So if I learned to read the stars, I'd maybe discover my future up there. It would solve a lot of problems." "And spoil a lot of mysteries," Malingo said. "Better not to know? Better to find out when the time's right. Everything to its hour." "You're right, of course," Candy said. Perhaps a wiser eye than hers would be able to read tomorrow in tonight's stars, but where was the fun in that? It was better not to know. Better to be alive in the here and the now, in this bright laughing moment, and let the hours to come take care of themselves. Journey to the end of day, come the firefly, come the moon. Say a prayer for God's good grace, and sleep with love upon your face. So ends the first book of Abarat. Appendix. Some excerpts from Klepp's Almanac. For a traveler in the Abarat, there can be few documents as useful or as thorough in their contents as Klepp's Almanac. It was first published some 200 years ago, and it is a stew of fact and fiction in which the author, Samuel Hastrom Klepp, writes one moment as a practical explorer, the next as a mythologist. There are significant errors on every page, but there is some reason to believe that Klepp knew that he was playing fast and loose with the truth. He speaks at one point of his leavening the flatbread of what we know with the yeast of what we dream may come to pass. However questionable its value as a work of truth, there is no doubting the hold Klepp's Almanac has on the hearts of the people of the Abarat. The almanac is updated yearly by the current descendant of Klepp, Samuel Hastrom V. He has kept the contents of the pamphlet much the same as it always was. It chronicles holy days around the archipelago, carries tables of tides and stars, lists all manner of event, mythical and actual. It carries the rules of two of the Abarat's favorite sports, Mycassian bug wrestling and star striking. It also lists celestial events, both benign and apocalyptic, carries news of appearing islands, and for those with a taste for grim inevitability, it chronicles the steady, if infinitesimal, sinkage of other islands. Besides these, contained within the almanac's pages are news of extinctions, migrations, emancipations, and redefinitions of the infinite, while for those seeking more practical information, it contains maps of every island and of every major city, including those that have been destroyed by time or calamity. It is, in short, the essential guide to the archipelago. Even if, as one Django Johnson once calculated, no less than 57% of its information is for some reason or other questionable, every sailor and traveling salesman who crosses the Abarat, every pilgrim and pig farmer about the business of worship or gelding, has a copy of the almanac within reach, and each finds in its contradictory pages something of value. I would, if I could, reproduce it all here. But that's, of course, impossible. I will limit myself instead to Klepp's eloquent descriptions of the major hours, including the 25th, with a few references to what the author dubs rocks of some significance, though it is necessarily incomplete. Small islands appear and disappear in the Sea of Isabella all the time. A complete listing would be out of date the moment it was printed. I will list the hours as Klepp did, beginning at noon. However, I strongly urge anyone tempted to use the information that follows as a literal guide to the islands to proceed with extreme caution. It is worth remembering Samuel Klepp I died having become lost on one of the outer islands. He was found dead from exposure with a copy of his own almanac in his hand. According to a detailed map in the almanac that he himself had drawn, there was supposed to be a small town that bore his name on the very spot where he had perished. He had no doubt been looking for the town when exposure overtook him. As it happened, no such town existed. But since his death, a town has been founded at that place to service the sightseers who come to see the spot where the great almanac maker perished. And yes, it is called Klepp. His map, then, was correct. It was simply premature. Such things happen often in the archipelago, especially on those islands closest to the 25th hour, so be warned. Here, then, are some brief excerpts from Klepp's descriptions of the 25 islands of the Abarat. Of the island of Isil, which is noon, let me say this. It is a place of exceptional beauty and fruitfulness. Furthermore, it does a soul good, sometimes, to stand with the sun directly over his head. Here at Izzl, a man hoping for fame might be reminded to live in the moment and not care too much where his shadow may fall tomorrow, but rather concern himself with where it lies today. The island is temperate and lush. A gentle breeze passes constantly through the thick foliage, and there are creatures of every shape and size being wafted through the greenery. It is said their singular source is a creatrix of very ancient origins called the Princess Breath, who makes her home here on Izzl and is in the infinite and rapturous process of conjuring life forms from her divine essence, which the breeze carries through the canopy and out across the Sea of Isabella. There, caught by this tide or that, they are carried out across the islands to populate them with new kinds of life. At 1 o'clock, which lies to the south-southeast of Izzl, is the island of Habarucus. Traditionally, this has been a haunt of sea bandits and buccaneers. 1 o'clock being my lunching hour, I have many times sought a healthy repast upon this island, and may happily report that whatever fiendish piratical types haunt the island, their presence has not deterred the cooks of Habarucus from becoming fair geniuses of their craft. I will tell you plainly, there is no better food to be had at any hour. The topography of the island of Habarucus is unattractive. It's mostly rocky, though there are areas of the interior where the ground becomes unpredictably swampy. These areas, which the Habarucans called the Sinks, are the habitats of Kalakwa birds, which species reportedly hatch downy human babies from their eggs every 9th year. These children, if saved from being pecked to death by juveniles of the previous year's hatching, are often saved by the pirates and raised as their children. This means the island, far from resembling a vile enclave of thieves and murderers, resembles instead an island of wild children watched over fondly by that aforementioned vile enclave of thieves and murderers, like mothers watching over their errant, and occasionally lightly feathered, children. At 2 lies Orlando's Cap, which is not an island I know well. An asylum for the insane is located here, so placed because its founder, Izzard Coin, believed 2 in the afternoon to be an hour that promotes a healing balm in the soul. The island, however, is so ill-favored that it's hard to imagine those prone to irrationality being much comforted there. The island's name, by the way, comes from its cap-like shape. I can find no evidence of who Orlando was, nor, I suppose, do the sorrowful occupants of the island much care. It should be noted, for those interested in either the products of the insane mind or in art, and how often are those things one and the same, that Coin's healing methodologies included allowing his patients the means to create. Thus, scattered across Orlando's Cap are artifacts that his patients fashioned. Some are of humble ambition, but others seem to be entire fantastic worlds carved from stone or wood and often painted in hallucinatory colors. When we look at the way the islands are arranged in the Sea of Isabella, there seems to be a designing hand at work which conspires with nature to unseat our expectations. Thus, close beside the island of Orlando's Cap, which is a place of dour scenery, albeit enlivened by the creations of Coin's patients, there lies the Nonce, which is to my eye the most beautiful of all the islands. How is it that they can be so different from one another when they are divided by a passage of water so narrow you might skip it with a stone? 3 in the afternoon, the island of the Nonce is a dreamy time. The labors of the day are more than half over, and our thoughts turn to what pleasures the twilight hours may hopefully provide. Personally, I enjoy a siesta around this time, and I can testify to the fact that those who doze in the Nonce do not conjure ordinary dreams. They imagine the beginning of the world. I have done so myself several times, slept there and dreamed of some Edenic place where there was no enmity nor division between plant and animal, angel and man. This suggests to me that there is some validity to the claim, which was made in the highest of metaphysical circles, that the Nonce is the island where life on the archipelago began. So on to Nomon, which lies at 4 o'clock. Here I wish to interlude with a little piece of autobiography. Some years ago I lost my wife, literally lost her in a maze on Soma Plume. I was, needless to say, much distressed by this. I was uncommonly fond of her, and, taking the advice of my brother-in-law, I went to Nomon in search of an oracle who might enlighten me as to my wife's whereabouts. Despite the bland reputation of the hour, there's nothing very mystical about 4 in the afternoon. The place is littered with the ruins of temples and other oracular sites. In some parts of the island, the air is filled with whispering voices, like the scraps of 1,000 unfulfilled prophecies. Personally, I find it a rather unsettling place, its most distressing location being the north shore, from the cliffs of which a visitor may look across the Straits of Limbo toward the Island of Midnight. There is nothing of that despicable hour visible at such a distance, of course, except for sheer rock and veils of roiling crimson mist. But it's more than enough to get the most impoverished of imaginations feeling clammy. Anyway, back to my story. The oracle I spoke with on Nomon did indeed give me some information that finally led to the retrieval of the missing Mrs. Klepp. But while searching for the oracle, I discovered an extremely strange phenomenon. Nomon has upon it a number of roads that seem to have no destination. The theory I offer for this is that Nomon was once part of the adjacent island of Soma Plume, which is twice its size. What cataclysm caused the land between the two islands to sink can only be guessed at, but it would certainly explain the mystery of the roads, because their destination would then be the great Noahic ziggurat on Soma Plume. The ziggurat has been, since time immemorial, a place of burial, and for that reason there are many who dub themselves explorers and gazetteers who haven't dared venture there. Pah! To their cowardice, I say. In my travels I have never had dealings with the deceased that were ever less than pleasant. This is particularly true of the long since dead. Those recently deceased can be irritable on occasion. Anyway, I urge you not to be put off by the rumors about the Noahic ziggurat. It is an astonishment. Travelers by ship, especially those who are piloting their own vessels, should be warned that the next leg of the trip, the passage from Soma Plume to Babylonium, which lies but an hour away at 6 o'clock, can be treacherous. Not because the waters of the Isabella are particularly choppy thereabouts, but because there is always such a convergence of happy souls about the hour of 6 that navigation between the hundreds of boats which throng the straits is difficult. I've witnessed countless collisions and capsizings in the narrow band of water, even, I'm sorry to say, an occasional fatality marring otherwise joyful expeditions. What need I tell you about Babylonium? If you know even a little about these islands of ours, then the reputation of this pleasurable hour will be perfectly familiar to you. If you are tired of Babylonium, so the saying goes, then you are tired of life, for among its tents and its stages, its hippodromes and its arenas, is every species of frolicsome thing that can be devised by masker, menagerist, musician, mountebank, or magician. I have never left that island but with a sense that I have taken only a sip of its pleasures, and promising myself I will return there soon. Perhaps the heaviness of my heart is increased because of the sight that lies ahead, the island of lengthening shadows, Scoriae. You will forgive me if I don't linger over the details of that ashen place overmuch. Scoriae depresses the soul. Scoriae is not, of course, the only island of the Aberrat that can so readily overshadow a man's natural capacity for joy. So, as I've said elsewhere, does midnight. So, too, for different reasons, which I'll come to later, does the Isle of the Black Egg, which stands at 4 in the morning, and even Specklefru, which stands at 5. But there is much about Scoriae which invites a particular mournfulness. It is bleak, of course, a sprawling mass of laval rock and black dust, with the open wound of the volcano Mount Golly at its center. Golly's spewings and ragings have, over the ages, claimed 3 magnificent cities, Gosh, Divinium, and Mycassius. To wander in the ruins of any of the 3 is a melancholy business. All were noble cities, filled with fine and loving souls. Not one of these souls, to my knowledge, survived Golly's tantrums. Only the signs of their lives remain to us, clotted in volcanic ash, their temples, their racetracks, their nurseries. I remarked earlier that I have never met a dead fellow whose company I did not enjoy. I should except some of the ghosts of Gosh, who were, on one occasion some years back, rude enough to drive me out of their city with their howlings and their batterings. But I should add this, that I had just reached the safety of my boat when Golly gave a growl and belched a rain of liquid rock which fell where I had been exploring mere minutes before. The ghosts, in short, had meant me no harm with their assault. They simply didn't want to add my name to the toll of Golly's victims. Now we must make a journey from one side of the Abarat to the other, moving in a south-southwesterly direction. The journey, of course, still takes an hour, for we are going to 8 o'clock in the evening to the Yeba Dim Day. The island of Yeba, the Great Head as it is colloquially called, is carved in the likeness of its sometime owner, Gorky Dudat, and is a warren of tunnels and tiny ramshackle habitations. Perched on Dudat's stone cranium, an addition only made after the potentate's passing, are 6 towers occupied by those personages rich enough for such lofty apartments. Reportedly, some of these towers contain inhabitants of immense age, the ancients of the Ife nation, who were the first architects of the islands. I cannot confirm or deny these rumors. Over the years, the Yeba Dim Day has become the informal capital of the inner islands, and much bureaucratic work is done in the labyrinths of Gorky Dudat's head. Here an Aberatic may obtain birth papers, death papers, sea charts, maps, and the like. The price list is on the wall close to the entrance to the Great Head. In many cases, the price of maps and charts has remained at a zem or 2 in all the years that I've been exploring the islands. My own modest printing press is here at 8 o'clock, a small office at the base of the towers. The Yeba Dim Day marks the last hurrah of daylight. By the time we reach Hefeker, which stands at 9 o'clock in the evening, every last trace of sunlight has departed from the skies. Hefeker is an impressive island, topographically speaking. Its rock formations, especially those below ground, are both vast and elaborately beautiful, resembling natural cathedrals and temples. The greatest of these is Happ's Vault, discovered by one Lydia Happ. Even if it were simply a cavern, it would be notable enough for the uncanny precision of its symmetries, but it is not. It is Miss Happ who was the first to suggest the Chamber of Skein. The skein? How do I begin to describe the skein? The word, of course, has humble origins. It means a length of yarn or thread that has been wound on a reel. But the Aberatic skein, as Lydia Happ describes it, is something far more significant. It is the thread that joins all things, living and dead, sentient and unthinking, to all other things. According to the persuasive Miss Happ, the thread originates in the vault of Hefeker, appearing momentarily as a kind of flickering light before winding its way invisibly through the Abarat to begin the task of connecting us one to another. I have twice visited the vault, and on both occasions saw phenomena that could well fit Lydia Happ's theory. Fine lines of light crisscrossing the cavern, Perhaps what I saw was an optical illusion, and the idea of infinite connectedness is pure sentimental invention. But what we want to believe and what is true are, I think, more closely related than the rationalists would sometimes have us believe. Personally, I do not doubt that some power connects us to everything else in our archipelago, even if we would wish it otherwise, for we are not just joined to what pleases our eyes and our morals, but also to what is shameful and ugly. We are indisputably a part of a greater system than ourselves. Until somebody comes along with a better idea, Lydia Happ Skane will do very nicely. From the grandiose scale of Huffaker, we move on to 10 o'clock and the more modestly scaled Ninnyhammer, an island which boasts very little that's noteworthy, except perhaps the small town of High Sladder, which is occupied by a tribe of feral tarry-cats. On a hill to the northeast of the island is a house of odd construction with a dome that, when approaching the island by boat, can in some lights resemble an eye. I believe it has been the domicile of wizards over the years. I have little else to say about the island, having been sworn to secrecy on the matter of wizardly goings-on. Close by, however, is a rock of some distinction called Alice Point. It is a tiny place, but it was for some years the best spot from which to see Autumn's Spire, which stands at the 25th hour. A viewing platform was built on the point, and large telescopes were brought to the island. A tempest of unusual ferocity brought the structure down after a time, however, and there is a body of opinion that believes this tempest originated in the spire because those who occupy the 25th hour have no wish to be spied upon. I have heard these entities referenced to as the Phantom Maya, but who or what these creatures might be is beyond me. The remains of the viewing tower, by the way, can still be seen if you sail close to Alice Point, but the rock itself no longer has human occupants. On then to 11 o'clock and the island of Gibberish. This is truly a place of paradoxes. Though most of the island is bare rock, there is a curious mutability in the air here. You look away for a moment, and that rock, which seemed so solid a moment ago, seems to have flowed into some new configuration. It's easy to become lost here, though the island isn't large. No path remains in the same place for long. A tribe of women has traditionally occupied Gibberish, and it is their appetite for making the island unpalatable for visitors, especially male visitors, that is largely responsible for the protean nature of the landscape. Over the centuries, these extraordinary women have caused the elements of Gibberish to defy the laws by which those elements conventionally live. Rock is fluid here. Fire burns cold, water is like iron, and the air, which we expect to serve our needs invisibly, is here a sovereign power in its own right. The very name of the island is derived from the means by which the air continues to alter the very words a visitor may speak, turning sense into nonsense or gibberish. What comes next, of course, is the Island of Midnight, also called Gorgosium. What few observations I will offer here must be prefaced with the confession that I have never set foot on that hour, nor have any wish to do so. Gorgosium is wreathed in red mists which seem to have a serpentine life of their own. The old fortress of Iniquisite, with its 13 towers, dominates the heights of Midnight and looks down with frightful authority on the joyless landscape below. The Carrion family has, of course, occupied Gorgosium since the beginning of written history, and what attributes the island may or may not possess, all of this information is third or fourth hand, is their handiwork. A forest of gallows, a morbid garden that contains every harmful plant in creation, a collection of machines devised to torment and murder, all these are rumored to exist on the island. But these are the least. There is a great deal more which I will not sully the pages of this almanac by relating. Instead, I will move on, as one might move on past a fetid cadaver, in the hope of discovering some sweeter sight. We are now, of course, in the very dead of night. The skies are star-pricked overhead. There is a great quiet. And there is no quieter place in the Abarat than at 1 o'clock in the morning, where the 6 pyramids of Xugxux arise out of the dark and uncannily placid waters of the Isabella. Not far from here, visible across the Straits of Segunda, is the Noahic ziggurat on Soma Plume, which I have previously described. The silhouette of the ziggurat is of course remarkably close to that of the Xugxux pyramids, and there are those who have suggested that all 7 structures were designed by the same hand and built by the same masons. I disagree. The tombs of Soma Plume are, as I stated earlier, calm and curiously reassuring places. The 6 pyramids at Xugxux, however, perhaps owing to their proximity to midnight, are sites of mystery and tragedy. 4 of the 6 have been broken into and gutted by thieves, but the 2 largest remain unpenetrated, their locks beyond the wits of even the most ambitious master criminal. There is little doubt that they are occupied, however. Something lives and breathes in the Great Pyramids. I do not claim to know what. Moving on to the northwest, we come to Egypt, which is, in the opinion of this explorer, an island of immense charm. I have never visited the island sober, I will admit, so my view may be somewhat influenced by that fact, but Egypt is an island that encourages excesses, a kind of happy foolishness. This is at first glance an unlikely place for clowns. It shares with neighboring Gorgosium a spiky barren topography, and storms rage perpetually about the landscape. It has been calculated that a visitor to Egypt is more likely to be struck by lightning than a man on the roosts of Efreet is to be hit by bird excrement. I can personally testify to this. I have been struck 3 times while climbing the heights of the island. The experience is quite refreshing, akin to taking a plunge in icy water. Yes, it certainly takes the breath away. But when it's over, one is left either dead or invigorated. An extreme choice, I grant you, but life untouched by such extremes would be dull indeed. Leaving Egypt and taking now a northeasterly course, we approach Pion with its instantly recognizable arch. Pion was once a quiet island, but no longer. The work of an entrepreneur by the name of Rojo Pixler has transformed the island utterly. It was Pixler's dream, some have said folly, to build the biggest city in the archipelago on Pion, its lights so bright that the darkness of the hour would be a grand irrelevance. Using funds built up through his titanically successful household products, Pixler has created his own dream city. By bringing together the genius of wizards and the skills of more conventional architects, all touched by their own genius, Pixler has not only transformed Pion, but may eventually, and to the mind of this writer, regrettably, transform the entire archipelago. Nobody is safe from the panacea or from its relentlessly happy salesman, the Comexo Kid. Pixler's flying machines are now venturing far from the skies over Pion, while his burrowings beneath the seabed, where he intends to build a second city, 3 times the size of Comexo City, have dug through layers of rock which is filled, so I'm told by friends who are experts in their fields, with never-to-be-duplicated evidence of our earliest beginnings. But it is probably fair to say that a man like Rojo Pixler has no interest in the past. He looks only toward tomorrow. A life lived in perpetual expectation may be a fine thing for a time, but it's a young man's game. Mr. Pixler has apparently yet to be touched by the shadow of his mortality. When that happens, I venture, he may be more respectful of all that lies quietly in the earth, as he will one day be its fellow. I apologize for such dark ruminations, but they come to me naturally when I contemplate the god of Comexo City. nor is there much comfort to be discovered in the so-called outer islands, of which Pion was once a member. Now there are only 4 in that group: the Isle of the Black Egg, Specklefru, Efreet, and Outland. They are unquestionably the least pretty, the least charming, the least seductive of the archipelago, but that is not to say that they don't possess a considerable degree of drama. At 4 o'clock on the Isle of the Black Egg, for instance, lie the Pious Mountains, a range of needle-sharp crags that are the tallest natural phenomenon in the islands. In fact, the top of Autumn's Spire at the 25th hour is closer to heaven, but there is nothing natural about the spire, I would submit. It is surely the work of some less than divine architect. The Pious Mountains, despite their inaccessibility, are not unpopulated. In the early days of the Abarat, during the Celestial Wars, guerrilla forces hid there and used their area as a base for devastating attacks on the fleets of the Empress Deviavex. The descendants of those rebels still have communities in Pious Heights, as they call the mountains, and there live a life of blameless and uncommon purity. As to the Black Egg, which gave the island its name, I can say only this. I have discovered to date 217 explanations for the name, each contradicting the next. As I cannot distinguish the value of any one explanation over any other, and it seems arbitrary to simply pick one for retelling here, I'd prefer to simply state that nobody knows how the island got its name and leave it at that. Moving on west along the line of the outer islands, we come to 5 o'clock and Specklefru. It is geographically an uneventful island. The earth sandy and covered with fine, sharp-edged grass, the wind always howling. Though the terrain is scarcely varied, the island is home to a wide variety of species, most of them dangerous. The knot, the scab-faced snouter, the rife, all have their habitats in the undulating grasslands of Specklefru. And when ground is contested, or eggs are trampled or stolen, the ensuing battles can be brutal and bloody. In short, Specklefru is less an island than it is a bestiary, and it is not to be trespassed lightly. The next of the outer islands is Efreet. Unlike its neighbor Specklefru, which has always been a wild spot, Efreet was once an island of great sophistication. The city of Koi, considered to have been the most cultured city in the Abarat, was built on the lower steps of the island, which lies to the northeast. Opinions vary as to how long Koi stood and why it fell, but what remains of the city, rows of pillars, archways, frescoes, testify to a site of elegance and learning. In recent times, the ruins have become the haunt of lost and unhappy souls, and it seems impossible, visiting its mournful shores, that there was once a bright world here. Efreet's hour, I should add, is 6 in the morning. At 7 lies Outland, which is joined to Efreet by the Gilhawley Bridge. There is a palace on Outland, built for Queen Muzzle McCrae, to a design that appeared to her in a dream, or so local legend dictates. The Queen's husband was a creature called Nimbus, Lord of the Tarry Cats. He still lives in McCrae's palace, inside the dream, so to speak, of the woman he loved. Just a few islands remain to be described. At 8 o'clock, as the day brightens, stands Obadiah, an island of extraordinary flora. Here a visitor will find strange and sometimes aggressive plants growing in virtually inexhaustible profusion. Some have called Obadiah the elegiac's garden and suggested it may have been a kind of laboratory in which the mythic creators of Abarat, Azo, and Cha experimented with life forms. Some even claim to have seen the one-eyed Azo wandering the plant-thronged slopes of Obadiah, his presence causing the flowers to open long dormant eyes and reach toward him as if to catch his gaze and share some secret of the earth. At 9 in the morning, we arrive at the island of Quam Ha. It is a puzzling place to explore because it has 2 distinct faces. At the western edge of the island stands the busy seaport of Tasmagore, where the food is good, the people happy, and the air filled with the din of extemporized songs. Tasmagorians hold festivals regularly in which competitors create epic songs on the spot from subjects chosen by the crowd. Its reigning champion is one Sally Sullywort, who at the last festival beguiled the audience with a 9-minute song on the subject of fish gutting. Outside the bounds of Tasmagore, toward the eastern end of the island, the land is empty. Nobody builds there, not so much as a shack. This is peculiar, given how crowded Tasmagore has become of late, but nobody I spoke to would tell me why. Onward, then, to Spake, which is an island I always take the greatest pleasure in visiting. It is a splendid green place with many cypress trees on its lower slopes. On its heights, above the trees, stands a simple stage which has been used for performances of every kind, circuses, slapsticks, and high tragedy since the beginning of known time. It may seem curious to a visitor that a drama would be performed in the open at 10 in the morning, but in fact the actors who first performed here, Norta Geese and Arlo Godkin, chose well. By a strange miracle of the island's location, Geese and Godkin's theater is every 3 days shrouded in a mist that blows from the southeast and surrounds the hill in a dark blanket. Tiny flames, like the sloughings of stars, litter this dark fog and magically illuminate the dramas that are performed on the heights of the hill. Onward, then, to Nully at 11. Topographically speaking, the island merits little study, but it is the location of one of the Abarat's most extraordinary buildings, the Repository of Remembrance. From the outside, the repository is a large but commonplace building. Inside, however, it is anything but commonplace. Its rooms, which number over 100, are filled to capacity with objects that were once loved by the mighty. The toys of emperors, the rag dolls of queens, the stuffed crocodile which the great warrior Duke Lutherid of Scant was devoted to in his old age, the 17,000 porcelain mice Prince Drudru played with as a child. Room after room, cabinet after cabinet, shelf after shelf. The repository is filled with bric-a-brac loved to distraction by people whose devotion at times suggests a touch of madness. I have described some 24 hours and 24 islands, plus, of course, the occasional rock. Only the 25th island remains to be described, though I know already that its mysteries will outwit my pen in a heartbeat. I will, therefore, keep my description simple. The 25th hour lies at the center of the archipelago. It is called, among other things, Whence and Lud and the House of the Phantomia. But it is most frequently referred to as Autumn's Spire. When it comes to the history and purpose of the island's spire, or to an evocation of its undeniably sentient mists, or the strange music the Sea of Isabella makes when she breaks upon its shores, utterly unlike any other sound her waters make, breaking on sand or stone, all this is beyond me. No doubt the claims of the righteous Bandy, a criminal who ended up on the shores of the 25th by chance and who escaped a poet, are correct. Every mystery of the Abarat, he said, has its solution here. Every enchantment its source, every prayer its destination. Beyond that, neither he nor I can say much more. There are no books about the spire, for no writer that I know of, except Bandy, has gone there and returned. There are, however, innumerable paintings, though not one of them resembles any other. Autumn's Spire, it seems, possesses a very particular glamour. No two witnesses sailing past it will see quite the same sight. What this may indicate about the nature of the island's interior may only be imagined. Here, then, is a brief taste of Klepp's almanac. As noted at the beginning of this appendix, the information offered here should not be taken as definitive, but may be usefully consulted both by those who wish to explore the Abarat on foot and those braver adventurers who wish instead to close their eyes and dream their voyages. Samuel Hastrom Klepp.
The End. You've been listening to Abarat by Clive Barker, narrated by Richard Ferrone. This work is copyrighted 2002 by Clive Barker. This recording is copyrighted 2002 by Recorded Books. If you've enjoyed this book and this performance, Recorded Books recommends Ghost Boy by Ian Lawrence, narrated by George Guidall. You'll find a wide selection of titles in the Recorded Books catalog, including bestsellers, mysteries, classics, histories, and more. So, to order another recorded book, or for a copy of our latest listing, please call us using the toll-free number found on the back of the book. You can order by phone with any major credit card, or by writing to us, or by faxing us. Don't forget to ask about easy 30-day rentals by mail. On our website, you can browse the catalog, hear about the latest releases, place orders, or tune into narrator profiles and author interviews. So visit us there at www.recordedbooks.com. And thank you for being a Recorded Books reader.